The bedroom door was locked from the inside. That detail appeared in almost every account written about the morning of July 24th, 1948, when the staff of Cissy Patterson's Massachusetts and Avenue mansion couldn't rouse her. She had gone to bed the night before. That much was established. She had, by most accounts, not seemed well. The door was locked. They broke it down eventually, or had someone who could, and they found her there, Eleanor Meadow Patterson, age 67, dead in her bed, in the house she had filled with antiques and enemies in roughly equal measure. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, which is technically true of every death, and specifically uninformative about this one. There were rumors. There were always rumors with Cissy. She had spent 40 years cultivating a life that generated them. And the rumors this time involved pills and isolation and the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up on a death certificate. 7 days later, her will was read. She had left the Washington Times-Herald, her newspaper, the one she had clawed away from William Randolph Hearst and built into the highest circulation paper in the capital, to 7 of her employees. Not her daughter, not her grandchildren. 7 people who worked for her. Washington had seen a great deal. It absorbed the will anyway, the way a city absorbs things that confirm what it already suspected. Felicia, her only child, got almost nothing. The door had been locked from the inside. Make of that what you will. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the reading of a will when the numbers don't match what people expected. It isn't grief exactly. It's recalculation. Washington, in the summer of 1948, had been recalculating Cissy Patterson for decades. She had given them plenty of material. The parties at DuPont Circle that lasted until someone said something unforgivable. The editorials that named names, that settled scores so old the original grievance had been largely forgotten by everyone except Cissy. The feuds with Franklin Roosevelt, with Drew Pearson, with her own brother, with her own daughter, with the general concept of being told what to do. She had been a fixture of the city's social and political life for so long that people had stopped fully seeing her, the way you stop seeing a monument. And then she died and left her newspaper to her staff, and the monument turned out to have had opinions about all of them the whole time. The 7 employees were Frank Waldrop, her executive editor, Mason Peters, Edith Asbury, George DeWitt. Putting aside the question of whether this was generosity or one final editorial decision, the will was structured with the kind of precision that takes time. She had not dashed it off. She had thought about it. She had, at some point, sat somewhere in that large house and decided, carefully and with full awareness of what she was doing, to leave the thing she had built to the people who had helped her run it, rather than to the person she had made. Felicia Gizycka, her daughter, born in Poland in 1905 to a marriage that could charitably be described as catastrophic, received a trust that was, by the standards of the Patterson fortune, modest. Not nothing, but nothing like what might have been expected from a woman of Cissy's wealth leaving behind an only child. Felicia's response, when she eventually gave one, was not surprise. That was perhaps the saddest part. The will became a kind of Rorschach for everyone who had known Cissy. People who admired her read it as a statement of values. She was a newspaper woman first. She trusted her editors. She wanted the paper to survive, and she believed those 7 people were more likely to protect it than a daughter she had never fully been able to reach. People who had found her difficult, which was most people, read it as one last act of cruelty dressed up as principle. People who had studied her for long enough to know that both things were usually true of whatever she did declined to comment. The Times-Herald didn't survive long, regardless. The 7 employees, lacking either the capital or the particular force of will that Cissy had supplied in industrial quantities, sold it to Eugene Meyer of the Washington Post within a few years. The paper she had kept independent through the New Deal and the war and several nervous breakdowns, her own and the country's, was absorbed into the competition before the decade was out. If she had known that was coming, and she was sharp enough that she might have suspected it, She left no instructions. What she left instead was a library, a house full of objects, a set of papers that researchers would spend years sorting through, and a will that her daughter didn't contest, which was either grace or defeat, or the recognition that some arguments aren't worth having with someone who is no longer there to hear them. She had been born in 1881 into a family that treated newspapers the way other families treat land, as the thing you accumulate, inherit, fight over, and are ultimately defined by whether you want to be or not. Her grandfather was Joseph Medill, who had co-owned the Chicago Tribune and whose opinions about politics, race, and the proper function of American journalism were expressed loudly and in print for several decades. Her mother was Kate Medill Patterson, which meant something specific in Chicago. Her brother was Joseph Medill Patterson, who would go on to found the New York Daily News. Her cousin was Robert McCormick, who would run the Tribune with the energy and flexibility of a man who had never once considered that he might be wrong about anything. Into this family, Eleanor Medill Patterson was born second, a girl, and second. She spent the rest of her life making that as irrelevant as possible, with mixed results that nobody in the family was entirely comfortable discussing. By the time she died, she had been a Chicago debutante, a countess, a kidnapping victim's mother, a Washington socialite, a published novelist, a Hearst protege, a newspaper editor, a newspaper publisher, a newspaper owner, and the most feared woman in a city that ran professionally on fear. She had outlasted 2 husbands, several lovers, most of her enemies, and apparently her relationship with her daughter. The locked bedroom door was consistent with the general operating principle of her life, which was that she would decide when you got access. The will was the last thing she ever published. She had been a journalist long enough to know that endings matter, that the final paragraph does a specific kind of work, that what you choose to put last tells the reader what you actually think is most important. She put her employees last. Her daughter, she put somewhere in the middle, whether that was a statement or a wound, or simply the honest record of a life that had sorted itself out by its own brutal logic. That question did not get resolved in 1948, and it has not been resolved since. The door was locked from the inside. She had always preferred it that way. Joseph Medill died in 1899 and left behind a newspaper, a fortune, and a family that would spend the next 50 years demonstrating what happens when you give competitive, intelligent, difficult people both resources and grievances in equal measure. The Chicago Tribune was not just a paper. In Chicago at the turn of the century, it was something closer to a governing philosophy made physical. Printed daily, distributed widely, opinionated about everything from tariffs to the moral character of aldermen to whether certain immigrant populations were the kind of people who should be voting. Medill had built it that way deliberately. He believed journalism was power, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. This was, in the context of late 19th century American publishing, not unusual. What was unusual was how completely he transmitted that belief to his descendants, who absorbed it the way children absorb language, without being taught exactly and without being able to stop. His estate was divided between his 2 daughters, Kate, who had married Robert Patterson, a lawyer, and Nellie, who had married Robert McCormick, another lawyer. The lawyers were largely beside the point. What mattered was the Tribune stock, and what mattered about the Tribune stock was who would eventually control the paper itself. Kate Patterson's children were Joseph and Eleanor. Nellie McCormick's son was Robert, who would grow up to become Colonel Robert R. McCormick, a title he awarded himself with the cheerful lack of self-consciousness that characterized everything he did. The 3 cousins, Joe, Eleanor, Bertie, formed a kind of triangle around the Tribune inheritance, each at a different angle, none of them quite touching. Joe got along with Bertie well enough, in the specific way that men who share an institution can get along while privately believing they are the one who actually understands it. Eleanor did not get along with Bertie at all. Bertie, for his part, seemed to regard Eleanor as a complication that the family had not adequately planned for. What the family had not adequately planned for was Eleanor specifically, but the broader failure was structural. The Patterson-Medill dynasty was built on the assumption that the important work, the publishing, the editing, the wielding of institutional power, would be done by men. The women would attend things, they would marry appropriately or inappropriately. They would, if they had opinions, express them in the correct social registers, which did not include newsprint. Eleanor had opinions. She had always had opinions. As a child, she was described variously as willful, brilliant, exhausting, and impossible to manage, which in retrospect sounds less like a diagnosis than a preview. Her education was the standard education of a wealthy Chicago girl of the period, enough to be conversational, not enough to be threatening. And she found it insufficient in ways she couldn't fully articulate at the time, but would spend the next several decades articulating in print. She debuted in 1901. She was 20 years old, already too tall for current fashion ideals, already too direct for the drawing rooms she was supposed to be conquering. She was presented, she attended, she wore the dresses. She also, around this time, began reading everything she could find and forming views about it, which was not part of the program. The family watched this with the mild unease of people who have purchased a piece of furniture that doesn't quite fit the room but is too expensive to return. Her brother Joe is worth slowing down for, because Joe Patterson is one of the stranger figures in American newspaper history, and he was, in many ways, the closest thing Cissy had to a peer. He was a socialist in his 20s, genuinely, not performatively, the kind that writes pamphlets and means them, who later founded the New York Daily News, which became the highest circulation newspaper in the United States, built on crime coverage, photographs, and the reading habits of working-class New Yorkers. He made this transition without apparent discomfort, which tells you something about either his flexibility or his lack of conviction, depending on how charitable you're feeling. Joe and Cissy understood each other. They had the same instincts for story, for provocation, for the specific pleasure of making powerful people read something they didn't want to read about themselves. They fought sometimes, the way siblings fight when they are too similar, but the fights didn't accumulate the same scar tissue as her fights with Bertie, or with Hearst, or with her daughter. Joe she could disagree with and still recognize. When Joe died in 1946, 2 years before Cissy, she was diminished in a way that her enemies noticed and her friends tried not to mention. The Washington Times-Herald's editorial page in those last 2 years had a different quality. Still sharp, still capable of cruelty. But something had gone out of it. Some animal confidence that there was at least one other person in the world who thought the way she did. Bertie McCormick and Cissy Patterson disliked each other with the sustained focus that only family members can achieve. The Tribune remained a source of tension between them for decades, not because either of them was irrational about it, exactly, but because both of them were completely rational about it in ways that happened to be incompatible. Bertie believed the paper was his. Cissy believed that her grandfather's legacy belonged to all of them, and that Bertie's control of it was a historical accident that reflected poorly on the family's judgment. Bertie responded to this view by having it and its source not particularly influence anything he did. What Cissy eventually understood, and it took longer than it should have, which is true of most things people eventually understand about their families, was that the Tribune was never going to be hers. The structure of the inheritance, the structure of the industry, the structure of the early 20th century had all agreed on this point. She could marry into a title. She could write novels, she could charm presidents and terrify senators and be the most interesting person at every party she attended. And the paper her grandfather had built would still belong to the man who had the correct chromosomes and the correct last name. This did not make her accept it. It made her decide to get her own. The specific path from that decision to the Washington Herald in 1930 was neither straight nor clean, and we'll get there. but it's worth sitting for a moment with the family she came from. The inheritance she received and the one she didn't. The brother she loved and the cousin she resented, and the grandfather whose belief that journalism was power she had absorbed so completely she couldn't have separated it from herself if she'd tried. Joseph Medill built a machine for turning opinion into influence and handed it down to his grandchildren. Two of them ran major newspapers. One of them became the most feared publisher in Washington. He had intended it for the boys. The count's name was Joseph Gizicki, and he was, by most contemporary accounts, extraordinarily handsome, deeply in debt, and dangerous in the specific way that people are dangerous when they have nothing left to lose except their charm, which they therefore protect at all costs. He was Polish nobility, which in 1904 meant something and nothing simultaneously, a title attached to a crumbling estate in the Ukrainian borderlands, a social position that still opened doors in certain European drawing rooms, and a financial situation that required, with some urgency, the kind of correction that a wealthy American heiress could provide. This was not an unusual arrangement in the Gilded Age. Titled Europeans and Moneyed Americans had been finding each other useful for decades. Henry James had written several novels about it. The novels did not end well, which nobody seemed to take as a warning. Cissy met Gizicki in Washington, where he had arrived trailing his reputation and his accent and his cheekbones, moving through the diplomatic circuit with the ease of a man who had been trained since birth to be impressive in rooms. She was 22. She was already restless in the way that intelligent women with insufficient outlet for their intelligence become restless, a low-grade fever that the period had no name for and no prescribed treatment except marriage. She found him compelling. She found the idea of him, the estate, the title, the escape from Chicago and her family, and the debutante machinery she had been fed through, possibly more compelling than the man himself. Her family had reservations. Her mother, Kate, had the kind of reservations that come from knowing exactly what a cash-poor European aristocrat is looking for in an American wife. Her grandfather was dead by then, but his tribune had an opinion about most things and would likely have had one about this. Cissy married him anyway in 1904. She was 23 years old, and she wanted out, and he was the most available exit. The marriage was bad quickly and catastrophic within a few years. Gizicki drank. He gambled. He was unfaithful with the thoroughness of a man who considers fidelity a convention designed for people with less interesting options. He was also, at intervals, physically violent, a fact that Cissy reported in letters home with a kind of controlled precision that suggested she was trying to be believed, which meant she had reason to think she might not be. The estate at Novoselica was cold, isolated, and staffed by people who spoke no language Cissy knew. She had gone from Chicago society to a crumbling manor in the Ukrainian borderlands, and the man she had married to escape one kind of cage had provided her with a smaller one. Their daughter Felicia was born in 1905. Whatever the marriage had been before, it reorganized itself around the child in the way that bad marriages do, the child becoming simultaneously the reason to stay and the reason that staying was becoming impossible. By 1908, Cissy had had enough. She took Felicia and left. Gizicki took Felicia back. This is the part of the story that people who write about Cissy Patterson treat carefully, because it is genuinely terrible, and because what happened next is genuinely strange, and it is difficult to discuss either thing without it sounding more dramatic than it already was, which is saying something. Gizicki had legal custody under Russian imperial law, which governed the region where the estate sat. Cissy had what mothers have always had when the law disagrees with them, which is to say, the law disagreed with her. She spent 2 years trying to get her daughter back through legal channels, diplomatic channels, every channel a wealthy American woman with connections in Washington and fury in sufficient supply could access. The channels did not work. What worked, eventually, was Tsar Nicholas II. Cissy's family had connections. Her father had connections. Someone knew someone who had access to someone in the imperial court, and the case was brought carefully, expensively, through the specific back corridors of late Tsarist Russia to the Tsar's personal attention. Nicholas II, who was 2 years away from the First Revolution and 8 years away from being shot in a basement, intervened in the custody dispute of an American woman and a Polish count on his empire's border. Felicia was returned to her mother in 1910. Sit with that for a moment. The Tsar of Russia settled Cissy Patterson's divorce. She got her daughter back. She also got, in the process, a complete education in what it meant to be a woman in a legal and political system that had not designed itself with her interests in mind, what it cost to fight it, who you had to know, what you had to become to make it listen. She would spend the next 4 decades running a newspaper that loved nothing more than making that kind of system uncomfortable. It would be too neat to say the marriage made her, but it showed her something about power. Who has it? How it actually moves? What it does to people who try to reach it through the approved channels that she hadn't fully understood before. Gizicki she divorced in 1917, by which point they had been effectively separated for nearly a decade. He died in 1926. She did not attend. Felicia was 15 when the divorce was finalized. She had spent the years between her return from Russia and the divorce in various schools and houses, attached to a mother who was brilliant and overwhelming and intermittently present. Whether Cissy knew how to be a mother after the years of fighting to be one, whether the fighting had replaced the thing it was supposed to protect, is a question that Felicia's later life answers in ways that are not comfortable to look at directly. There was a second marriage later, Elmer Schlesinger, an attorney whom she married in 1925 and who died in 1929, 4 years in. She mourned him genuinely by the accounts of people who were there. He was calm where she was not, steady where she needed it, and he seems to have been one of the few people in her adult life who neither needed something from her nor was afraid of her. Their marriage coincided with a period in which she was, by most reports, something approaching content. Then he died, and she went back to Washington, and the next year, Hearst gave her the Herald, and the rest of her life began. She never remarried. What the Gizicki years left behind, besides Felicia and the divorce decree, and a chapter that Cissy would eventually work into a thinly veiled novel called Glass Houses, was a specific texture to her anger. She had always had opinions. After Poland, she had a grievance. Not against Gizicki specifically. He was too small for the size of what she felt, but against the whole architecture of a world that had required her to find a czar to do what her own government and her own rights should have done. She carried that grievance into every room she walked into for the rest of her life. Sometimes it made her brilliant. Sometimes it made her cruel. Usually it was difficult to tell the difference until after she'd left. Washington has always been a city that runs on the management of appearances, which makes it a city where people who refuse to manage their appearances become, depending on your position, either terrifying or irresistible. Sometimes both, in sequence. Cissy Patterson arrived in Washington society in the years before the First World War as a divorced countess with a custody story that was already legend, a family name that meant something in Republican circles, and a quality that contemporary accounts struggle to name directly but circle around consistently, a kind of unfiltered attention that she directed at people and that felt, when it landed on you, like being the only person in the room. This is a skill, or it is a temperament, and it is not the same thing as warmth, though it can be mistaken for it. People who were later burned by Cissy Patterson occasionally noted that they had felt, in her presence, unusually seen. The feeling did not protect them. She leased a house on DuPont Circle and began the long project of becoming someone. This is perhaps an odd way to describe a woman who already had a name, a history, a daughter, and a title she no longer used, but that still preceded her into rooms. But what Cissy was building in these years was something more specific than a social position. She was constructing a persona sufficiently formidable that it could contain her actual self without the seams showing. The parties she threw became famous for the quality of their guest lists and the specific danger of attending them. Not physical danger, but the conversational kind. The sense that something true might be said before the evening was over, and that Cissy would be the one to say it. People kept coming back. People who had been wounded by her kept coming back. This is either a testament to her gifts as a hostess or a comment on Washington's relationship to people who will look directly at you. The affairs were not secret, which in that period meant they were conducted with a discretion so thin it functioned more as a shared fiction than an actual concealment. There was a rancher named Cal Carrington, whom she met in the West during the years she spent intermittently fleeing the East, and whom she may have genuinely loved in the particular way that people love the versions of themselves that emerge in different landscapes. She was a good writer. She had bought land in Wyoming, and she would disappear there sometimes, away from Washington and the family and the machinery of being Cissy Patterson. And in Wyoming, she was something slightly different, harder in some ways, quieter in others. Carrington was part of that life. He did not fit into the Washington one, and she did not try to make him. Then there was William Randolph Hearst. The Hearst relationship is difficult to categorize because it existed in several registers simultaneously for several decades, and neither of them, as far as the record shows, was entirely honest about what it was. They met in the early years of the century when Hearst was already building his empire and Cissy was building her legend, and they recognized in each other a version of the same appetite for influence, for the specific pleasure of being taken seriously in rooms designed to exclude them, for the exercise of power through print. That they became lovers at some point is generally accepted. That the relationship was, for Cissy, complicated by the fact that Hearst was also a mentor, a patron, and eventually her employer, is something the historical record allows you to see if you look at it steadily. She wrote for him. She learned from him. When she wanted the Washington Herald in 1930, he was the one who had it, and she asked him for it, and he gave it to her. First as a lease, then eventually she purchased it outright. The question of what that transaction cost her, beyond money, is not fully answerable. What is visible is that she spent her years as the Herald's editor and publisher going to considerable lengths to demonstrate that the paper was hers, that her voice was not his voice, that the institution he had handed her had been transformed into something he hadn't made. She succeeded mostly. The transformation was real. But Hearst's name appears in the margins of her career in the way that certain influences do, present in the structure, even when they're absent from the surface. The novel came out in 1926, Glass Houses. She published it under her married name, Eleanor Gizika, which was either a gesture toward the source material or a way of keeping a careful distance from her own family. It was thinly veiled enough that no one who knew her had any difficulty identifying the characters. The manipulative Polish count was identifiable. The trapped American wife was identifiable. The specific emotional texture of a marriage that destroys you in increments was identifiable to anyone who had been paying attention to her life, which in certain circles was everyone. Washington read it. Chicago read it. It sold well. Her family did not discuss it at dinner, which was the Patterson-Medill version of a review. What the novel revealed, and what her later journalism would confirm, was that Cissy had the instinct, and this is rarer than people think, to tell the truth about things that were personally costly to her without softening them into lessons. Glass Houses is not a book about surviving a bad marriage. It is a book about what a bad marriage does to the interior architecture of a person, the load-bearing walls it takes out. She wrote it without the comfort of a tidy ending, because she hadn't had one. By the late 1920s, the persona was fully constructed and operational. She was 45, 46, 47. The age at which women of her class and period were supposed to be settling into a dignified irrelevance, mentoring younger women, attending the right things, slowly releasing their hold on the rooms they had occupied. Cissy was doing none of that. She was, if anything, becoming more concentrated, the opinions sharper, the feuds more deliberate, the social presence more precisely calibrated to discomfort. Elmer Schlesinger died in 1929, and she grieved him, and then she turned back toward Washington like a person who has remembered what they were actually doing. The Depression was beginning. Roosevelt was coming. The newspaper industry was reorganizing itself around a new set of anxieties and possibilities, and Hearst, with the Washington Herald underperforming and his attention elsewhere, was about to offer her the thing she had been circling for 30 years. She had spent her adult life becoming someone capable of running a newspaper. She had done it without anyone planning for it, without the inheritance her grandfather's system would have given her, through the crooked path of a title she hadn't wanted, and a marriage that had nearly broken her, and a set of affairs and friendships and feuds that had, collectively, taught her more about how power actually moved than any journalism school could have. She was ready. She had been ready for a while. The Herald didn't know what was coming. The Washington Herald in 1930 was a middling paper in a city that deserved better, which is a polite way of saying it was losing money and losing readers and had the specific institutional listlessness of something that nobody with real authority actually cared about. Hearst had acquired it as part of his habit of acquiring things, and it sat in his portfolio the way certain properties sit. Technically an asset, functionally a drain, waiting for someone to either fix it or finish it off. Cissy Patterson leased it from him in August 1930. She was 49 years old. She walked into the newsroom on her first day, and the staff, by multiple accounts, did not know what to make of her. This was partly because she was a woman, and women did not run newspapers, and the staff were operating on the assumption that this arrangement was either temporary or decorative. It was partly because she arrived in the manner she arrived everywhere: direct, overdressed for the occasion, already apparently certain of things that the room hadn't agreed on yet. And it was partly because she looked at the newsroom the way someone looks at a house they intend to renovate, which is a look that makes the current occupants nervous for good reason. Within 6 months, circulation was up. Within a year, people in Washington were reading the Herald because they were afraid not to. The editorial philosophy she developed, and it was a philosophy, even if she would have laughed at the word, was built on several principles that the journalism of the period did not universally share. The first was that a newspaper should have a personality, and that personality should be visible in every section, not just the editorials. The second was that Washington's social and political life were not separate things, and should not be covered as if they were. The third, which was the one that made people genuinely uneasy, was that she was willing to use the paper the way her grandfather had used the Tribune, as an instrument of specific, targeted, personal opinion. But she was willing to do it in a city where the targets were present and could read it over breakfast. She wrote the Society column herself for a period, under the name Eleanor Cassell, which fooled approximately no one and was not really intended to. The column was remarkable by the standards of its genre, which had settled into a reliable form of elaborate flattery dressed as news, because it occasionally said true things. Not always kind things, true things. The distinction was not always welcome. Franklin Roosevelt arrived in Washington in 1933, and Cissy Patterson watched his arrival with an interest that curdled, over the decade that followed, into something considerably less charitable. She had known Roosevelt socially. She had known Eleanor Roosevelt, with whom she shared a complicated history that included genuine affection and the specific competitive awareness that women of similar intelligence and different temperaments have of each other. In the early New Deal years, the Herald was not hostile to Roosevelt. She was not by temperament an ideologue, and the Depression had produced a set of conditions that even people without ideological commitments could see required a response. What changed was the war, or rather, what the war revealed about where the lines were. Cissy Patterson was an isolationist. This is a position that requires some historical unpacking in the current moment because isolationism in 1940 and 1941 existed on a spectrum that ran from principled anti-interventionism on one end to something considerably darker on the other. And different isolationists occupied different points on that spectrum. Where Cissy sat is a question that her defenders and her critics answer differently. What is not disputed is that the Herald's editorial position in the years before Pearl Harbor was vigorously against American entry into the war, that this put her in alignment with her cousin Bertie's Tribune and her brother Joe's Daily News, and that Roosevelt found the Patterson-McCormick press axis sufficiently irritating that he referred to them, collectively and with presidential displeasure, as the three foul birds. She printed that. She was delighted to print that. The feud with Drew Pearson deserves its own paragraph because it was, even by the standards of Cissy's feuds, unusually sustained and unusually personal. Pearson wrote Washington Merry-Go-Round, a syndicated column that Cissy had run in the Herald, and that covered Washington political life with the kind of access and indiscretion that she should, in theory, have admired. She had admired it once. The relationship had curdled. There were professional disputes, there were personal ones. There was the additional complication that Pearson had briefly been married to Cissy's daughter Felicia, a marriage that lasted approximately as long as you might expect a marriage involving both Felicia Patterson and Drew Pearson to last, which was not long. She dropped the column. She ran pieces attacking him. He attacked back, with material that was sometimes sourced and sometimes not, and always damaging. The feud ran for years, past the point where either of them could have told you what the original grievance had been, sustained by the specific energy of two people who were good at exactly the same thing and despised each other for it. Washington watched with the appreciation of a city that understands this particular form of combat. What she built at the Herald, and what she took with her when she bought the Times and merged it with the Herald to create the Times-Herald in 1939, was something that the Washington newspaper landscape had not quite seen before. A paper that was simultaneously serious and personal, that covered power and wielded it, that had a proprietor whose name you could feel in every editorial decision without her having to sign every piece. By the early 1940s, the Times-Herald had the highest daily circulation of any paper in Washington, higher than the Post, higher than the Star. She had taken a failing property and made it, by the metric the industry actually uses, the most read paper in the capital of the United States. She had done it by trusting her instincts absolutely, by treating the paper as an extension of her own sensibility, by being willing to be wrong loudly and to be right loudly, and to make both feel like events worth reading. She had done it by working in a way that surprised people who expected a socialite playing at journalism, arriving early, staying late, reading everything, involving herself in decisions that publishers of her class and background traditionally delegated. She had also done it by being capable of genuine cruelty, the targeted editorial, the dropped column, the public humiliation of people who had crossed her, the use of the paper's platform to settle scores that had nothing to do with the public interest, and everything to do with Cissy Patterson's long memory and longer list of grievances. These things were not separate. The quality that made her brilliant was the same quality that made her vicious. She had not built a wall between her instincts and her power, and the paper reflected both sides of that without apology. By 1945, she was 64. The war had ended. Joe was dying. The isolationist position that had defined the paper's editorial identity for 5 years had been overtaken by events in the specific way that positions get overtaken. Not refuted, exactly, but rendered beside the point by the scale of what had actually happened. She adjusted without fully acknowledging that an adjustment had been made. The last years at the paper had a quality that people who were there later described with careful language: driven, erratic, sometimes brilliant, sometimes merely loud. She was drinking more, she was sleeping less. The locked bedroom quality of her later life was becoming more pronounced. The isolation, the reliance on a small circle of staff who were loyal partly out of affection and partly out of the specific loyalty that forms around powerful people who are becoming frightening. She rewrote her will several times in those years. The final version was signed in 1947. There is a photograph of Cissy Patterson and her daughter Felicia taken sometime in the 1930s at one of the DuPont Circle parties or something like it. The kind of event that generated photographs as a matter of course. The kind of photographs that end up in archives because someone thought they were worth keeping. In the photograph, they are standing close together. They are both beautiful, in the particular way that the Patterson women were beautiful. Angular, self-possessed, the kind of face that reads as intelligent before it reads as anything else. They are smiling. You can look at that photograph for a long time and not be able to tell what is happening between them. That difficulty is probably the most accurate record we have of the relationship. Felicia Gizycka was born in 1905 in Poland to a marriage that was already failing, in a country that was not her mother's, in circumstances that her mother was already planning to escape. She spent the first years of her life in a crumbling estate in the Ukrainian borderlands with a father who was cruel and a mother who was desperate, and then she was taken from her mother, and then she was returned to her mother, and by the time any of this was resolved, she was 5 years old and had already lived more story than most people accumulate in decades. What a child makes of that kind of beginning is not something that gets recorded in archives. What gets recorded is the aftermath. The schools, the marriages, the public record of a life that was shaped by a start it didn't choose. Cissy loved Felicia. This seems important to establish before anything else, because the relationship was so thoroughly damaged by the time Cissy died that it can be easy to read the damage backward and conclude that the love wasn't real. It was real. It was also, from Felicia's perspective, intermittent, overwhelming, conditional, and expressed in ways that frequently resembled its opposite. The specific texture of Cissy's mothering was something that several people who knew both women described with the same careful imprecision. That she was too much and then not enough, and that the rhythm of the two was more destabilizing than either alone would have been. She would appear in Felicia's life with the full force of her attention, which was considerable, and then she would disappear back into the newspaper, or Washington, or Wyoming, or the next crisis. And Felicia would be left with the aftermath of having been the center of that attention and then not being it. There were schools. There were extended periods abroad. There was, threaded through all of it, the inheritance question, the awareness, growing as Felicia grew, that she was the daughter of a woman who had become powerful, and that this fact about her mother was both a gift and a problem, and that the two could not be cleanly separated. Felicia married 3 times. The first marriage, to Drew Pearson in 1925, lasted 4 years and produced a daughter, Ellen. The choice of Pearson as a husband is one of those decisions that looks, from the outside, like it might have been made partly to produce a reaction, and it produced one. Cissy was not pleased, for reasons that were at the time professional and personal, and eventually became the same thing. Whether Felicia married Pearson, knowing that her mother would hate it, is a question that the record does not answer directly. The record does note that Felicia was 20 years old, which is an age at which people make decisions for complicated reasons that they do not always fully understand themselves. The divorce from Pearson coincided with, and may have contributed to, the feud between Pearson and Cissy that would run for the rest of Cissy's life. Pearson later claimed, in the way that ex-husbands sometimes claim things, that Cissy had destroyed the marriage. Felicia did not, as far as the record shows, publicly agree or disagree with this characterization. She had learned, at some point, to be careful about what she said where it could be printed, which was a reasonable adaptation for the daughter of a newspaper publisher. The second and third marriages were quieter. Felicia eventually settled into a life that was deliberately not her mother's. Smaller, more private, located at a careful distance from the Washington that Cissy had made her domain. She wrote, eventually, she painted. She raised her daughter Ellen with a deliberateness that suggested she had thought carefully about what she did not want to repeat. What she said about her mother, in the interviews and the memoir she eventually wrote, was measured in the way that takes effort. Not cold, not forgiving, not angry in the simple way that would be easier to read. She described a woman who had fought for her with a ferocity that had defined her childhood, and who had then proceeded to be, as a daily presence, someone Felicia could not fully reach. She described the money, its presence and its absence, the ways it was used and withheld and dangled. She described the will without apparent bitterness, which was either genuine equanimity or the performance of it, and either way required a kind of control that her mother had never bothered to perform. What Cissy made of Felicia, what she actually thought, beneath the legal documents and the editorial decisions and the rewrites of the will, is harder to find. She wrote about her sometimes, in letters. The letters are not simple. There is love in them, and there is the specific frustration of a person who cannot understand why someone they love will not become what they need them to be, which is not the same as love, but often travels with it. She wanted Felicia to be tough, the way she was tough. She wanted her to have armor. What she could not see, or would not see, was that the armor she had built for herself had been constructed in response to specific wounds, and that some of those wounds she had inflicted herself, and that you cannot wound someone and then hand them the armor you built against someone else's wounds and expect it to fit. Felicia did not go into newspapers. The last years of their relationship, from what the record allows, were characterized by the specific exhaustion of two people who have been having the same argument for so long that neither of them remembers what the argument was originally about. There were periods of warmth, there were periods of silence, there was, running underneath both, the newspaper, its existence, its future, the question of what Cissy intended to do with the thing she had built and whether Felicia was part of that intention. The will answered that question with the precision of a final editorial. Felicia was in it, but not at the center of it. The employees were at the center. The paper was at the center. What Cissy had made was at the center. And what she had made with Felicia, which was messier and less finished and could not be bequeathed to anyone, sat at the margins of the document, acknowledged but not resolved. Felicia did not contest it. She had spent her life not contesting things that could not be won. There is something almost architectural about the way the relationship between Cissy and Felicia maps onto the rest of Cissy's life. The same pattern appearing at different scales, the same quality of fierce initial investment, followed by the same quality of eventual withdrawal. The same inability to stay in something that required a kind of sustained vulnerability she had trained herself out of somewhere in Poland, in a cold house, in the years when she had been fighting too hard to survive, to notice what the fighting was costing her. She got her daughter back. She spent the next 40 years trying to figure out what to do with her. She never quite managed it, which is not a condemnation. It is just what happened. There is a detail in the inventory of Cissy Patterson's estate that does not appear in most accounts of her life, possibly because it is small, and possibly because it is the kind of thing that only registers if you are already looking for it. Among the items cataloged in the Massachusetts Avenue mansion after her death was a collection of letters, bundled and tied, from the years of the Gizicki custody fight. Letters she had written during the 2 years she spent trying to get Felicia back. Letters she had received, from lawyers, from family, from people in the diplomatic community who were trying to help, from people who weren't. They had been kept, not archived in the institutional sense, not organized for posterity, just kept. In a box, in the house, in the bedroom where she died. She had held on to them for 40 years. What you do with that detail depends on what you believe about her. If you believe she was primarily a woman of sentiment, it confirms that underneath everything, the feuds, the will, the locked door, There was someone who remembered what it had cost to fight for something and could not bring herself to throw away the evidence. If you believe she was primarily a woman of strategy, it means something else. That she kept the letters the way she kept everything useful, as a record, as proof, as material. The honest answer is probably that she was both at different hours of the same day, and that the letters were both things simultaneously, and that she would have found the question irritating. She had wanted, more than most people understood, to be taken seriously. Not liked. She had released that ambition early, or had it released for her, but taken seriously, which is a different and more durable need. She had wanted to build something that would outlast the social position, the title, the marriages, the accidents of birth and gender that had defined the first half of her life. She had built it. The Times Herald was real. Its circulation was real. Its influence on Washington's political culture in the 1930s and 1940s was real and documented and not easily dismissed even by people who disliked everything it stood for. It lasted 6 years after she died. Then it was sold to the Post, which absorbed it the way large papers absorb smaller ones, completely without remainder. The bedroom door was locked from the inside. The letters were in a box. Felicia did not contest the will. Some things do not resolve. They just become, eventually, the past. Present in the structure of what came after. Visible if you know where to look, no longer asking to be answered.